I haven't told this story to anyone, not even my ex-wife, and especially not my daughter. If she knew how close I came to leaving her with nothing but a life insurance policy and a half-finished cabin in the Matsu Valley, she'd never let me back into the woods. But you look like the type who understands that the wilderness doesn't care about your weekend plans or your custody schedule. It's indifferent. That's the scariest thing about Alaska. Not the teeth or the cold, but the absolute silence of a land that doesn't care if you live or die. I'm 45. At that age, you start to feel the rust in your knees and the weight of your mistakes. I went out there to clear my head, or maybe just to prove I wasn't as soft as the divorce papers made me feel. It was late September. In Alaska, that's not autumn. That's the dying breath before the white sheet of winter drops. The air had that metallic, sharp tang to it, like sucking on a copper penny. I was scouting a ridge about 20 miles outside of Talkeetna, looking for a spot to take my girl for her first real hunt next season. I wanted it to be perfect. The day started with a heavy, oppressive stillness. You know the kind, where the birds stop gossiping, and even the wind seems to be holding its breath. The muskeg was soft under my boots, each step making a wet, sucking sound that felt too loud in the vacuum of the valley. I remember the smell of decaying devil's club and damp moss. It's a sweet, sickly scent of things returning to the earth. I was moving slow, my breath puffing out in rhythmic ghosts of steam. I wasn't scared then. I felt capable. I had my point 30-06 slung over my shoulder, a sidearm on my hip, and the arrogance of a man who thought he knew these woods. By midday, the light started to turn strange. The sun was a pale, sickly disk filtered through a gathering haze. I reached a dense stand of black spruce, stunted, twisted trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching out of the permafrost. That's when the silence changed. It went from a lack of noise to a presence. I felt a prickle at the base of my skull, that ancient reptilian part of the brain that remembers we used to be prey. I stopped. I didn't see anything, but I could smell it now. It wasn't the rot of the woods anymore. It was heavy, musky, like a wet dog left in a basement for a month, mixed with something sharp and acidic. I shifted my rifle to my hands, clicking the safety off with a sound that felt like a gunshot in that stillness. I scanned the shadows. The spruce trees were so tight together that the light didn't hit the ground. It just hung in the branches like cobwebs. Snap. It wasn't a twig. It was the sound of a heavy, bone-dry branch being crushed under a weight I couldn't imagine. My heart didn't just speed up. It slammed against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I told myself it was a moose. I prayed it was a moose. You can negotiate with a moose if you give them enough space. Then the shadow moved. It didn't run. It flowed. A patch of darkness between two trees detached itself and became solid. It was a grizzly, but not like the ones you see in the brochures. This was a mountain of fur and scarred muscle, a boar that had clearly survived a dozen winters by being the meanest thing in the valley. He was maybe 30 yards out, downwind, his head low and swinging like a pendulum. His eyes weren't angry. They were focused. He was evaluating me the way I evaluate a piece of lumber. I did what they tell you to do. I spoke to him. My voice sounded thin, cracking like a boy's. "Hey, bear! Whoa, bear!" I backed away, one agonizing inch at a time, trying not to trip on the treacherous roots. But the bear didn't huff or stomp. He didn't give me a bluff charge. He just kept coming, a slow, predatory walk that closed the distance with terrifying efficiency. He was testing the air, his black nose twitching, tasting the scent of my fear. The attack didn't happen with a roar. It happened with a sudden, explosive burst of speed that defied physics. 1 second, he was a hulking shape 20 yards away. The next, he was a blurred landslide of brown fur. I didn't even have time to bring the rifle to my shoulder. I fired from the hip, a desperate, blind shot that I later found only grazed his hump. The recoil sent the gun flying as he hit me. It felt like being struck by a freight train. The air left my lungs in a violent spray of red mist. I hit the ground hard, the back of my head bouncing off a rock, and for a second, the world went gray. Then the pain arrived. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a crushing, grinding pressure. He had my left shoulder in his jaws. I could hear the sound, the wet, sickening crunch of my own scapula breaking, a sound that resonated through my skull like breaking glass. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was focused on the heat of him. His breath was hot and smelled of old blood and fermented berries. I remember looking up and seeing the individual hairs on his snout, the yellowish tint of his teeth. My survival instinct took over, a cold, clinical voice in the back of my mind that said, "If you don't move now, you are a meal." I reached for my sidearm, but the holster was pinned under his weight. My left arm was useless, a dead weight of fire and agony. With my right hand, I did the only thing I could. I gouged. I shoved my thumb into his eye socket as hard as I could. I felt the squish, the wet resistance, and for the first time, the bear roared. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury. He let go of my shoulder to snap at my hand, and in that split second of release, I rolled. I didn't try to run. You can't outrun a landslide. I rolled into a depression between two large spruce roots and curled into a ball, lacing my fingers behind my neck to protect my carotid and spine. I played dead, but I wasn't playing. I was waiting for the end. He came at me again, raking his claws across my back. I felt the fabric of my heavy canvas jacket shred like tissue paper. The cold air hit the raw meat of my shoulders, and then the warmth of my own blood followed. He flipped me over like a pancake, his weight threatening to cave in my chest. I stayed silent. I bit through my lip to keep from crying out. I tasted salt and iron. He huffed over me for what felt like an eternity, his hot saliva dripping onto my forehead. He was waiting for a sign of life. I focused on a single blade of grass an inch from my eye, watching a small beetle crawl along it, totally oblivious to the carnage happening above. I thought about my daughter's face. I thought about the fact that I hadn't finished the porch on the cabin. That thought, that unfinished business, gave me a strange, icy clarity. Finally, the weight lifted. I heard him huffing, moving away a few feet, then stopping. He did this for 20 minutes, circling, watching, waiting for the corpse to twitch. I stayed frozen, even when the flies started to find the wounds on my back. I didn't move until the sound of his heavy footfalls faded into the distance, replaced by the return of that haunting, absolute silence. I crawled out of that hole 3 hours later. My left arm was a ruin, hanging by strips of muscle and stubbornness. I had to use my belt as a tourniquet, tightening it with my teeth and my one good hand until the world started to spin. The walk back to the truck was a fever dream. I moved like a ghost, terrified that every swaying branch was him coming back to finish the job. I used the sun as my compass, pushing through the brush, my boots sloshing with blood. I survived because I didn't fight the bear. I fought the urge to give up. The woods don't take the strongest. They take the ones who stop moving. I made it to the truck, drove with one hand until I hit the park's highway, and flagged down a trooper. I don't go out there to prove myself anymore. I go out there because I respect the boundary now. The lesson I learned wasn't about beating nature. It's that we are guests in a house that doesn't belong to us. When you go into the bush, you're stepping out of the food chain and into a place where your titles and your ego mean nothing. You're just calories and bone. If you can accept that, you might just make it home.